with Collective Mind. We run these community conversations once a month, and we're so happy to have you here with us for this one, which is a bit of a special edition, which we sometimes do. So we may have some more people still rolling in. We have more people registered, but we'll go ahead and get started. So hello. For those who already know me and those who don't, I'm Kirsten. I'm the founder of Collective Mind. And I also have two of my wonderful colleagues on the line, Emily and Seema, who's logged in as Collective Mind, here to support, which is great. Thanks, guys. So again, this is our community conversation. These sessions run monthly, and typically we have someone from our learning community who joins us as a co-host to present and share on a certain topic or experience that they've had, and kick off the conversation with that. This one is, as I said, a special edition. We've done this before. In particular, last November, we held a couple of special edition community conversations on a special topic. So those conversations were about the pandemic. This conversation is about donor funding to networks. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to share a little bit about a new initiative, a new research study that Collective Mind is kicking off on this topic. And then we will open it up for discussion. We will start that by just breaking you into very small groups, maybe even pairs, to say hello to your colleagues and start reflecting on the topic at hand. And then we'll come back into the full group and yeah, hear what you have to say about this. So again, welcome to the community conversation. And let me share my screen so that we can get started. Okay. All right, hopefully you all can see that screen share. So again, welcome. This is our community conversation. We are talking about donor funding to networks. And the premise for this is, as I mentioned, a new initiative, a new participatory research study, as it were, on donor funding to networks that Collective Mind is just kicking off. So this is the beginning of our process to undertake this research study. And as such, we wanted to use this community conversation to get your inputs and your ideas. The first step in this research study, the first phase actually of this research study, is all about outreaching within our community and beyond to help us design the research study, design the research questions based on your experiences, your insights, your needs, your challenges, your ideas. So that is the goal here today, is to give you a space and facilitate a conversation around all of those points, needs, challenges, ideas, etc., around donor funding to networks, so that we can integrate it into our research design. So let me explain a little bit about our research study as it's planned, as some background to this. So this study that we're undertaking, you see the basics here. We're going to engage both networks and donors. Our goal is to better understand donor support to networks in particular. And with that, we're really going to the basics. We're trying to understand the what, the why, and the how of donor funding for networks. And this is primarily because in our experience, we hear all the time that networks struggle with funding, struggle with fundraising, struggle with adequate funding, just a wide range of challenges. I'm not going to preview too much of it because you probably know these challenges because you've probably experienced them, and I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. But so for that reason, for one, and also because there is, as we've found at least, no evidence base out there about donor funding to networks, about how it's done, about why it's done, about good practice on either side, on the donor side or the network side. And so our goal here is to really start building that evidence base, starting with these basic questions of what, why, and how, to really build out our understanding of this. And eventually, at the end of this research study, we will be developing guidance both for donors and for networks to improve their and inform their fundraising approaches, and for donors to likewise improve their funding approaches. So really hoping to have something practical come out of this process. And that's our real purpose. That's what's driving this. And again, you know, as we as Collective Mind try to both provide information and relevant guidance and such to you all as our learning community, and as we try to be thought leaders, this is a topic that again comes up over and over and over again. So that is why we're focusing some pretty significant attention here. So I just want to go through these basic questions so that you get a bit more understanding of our framing for this before we start the discussion. So again, I mentioned, you know, the what, why, and the how, or the why is we're starting in this list. I'm going to go through each of them. So just briefly, again, so we're trying to understand a little bit more about why donors fund networks and what that means to them. So what are their objectives? What are their expectations? Are there different rationales for different types of funding? What are they trying to achieve? Are there certain, you know, outputs, outcomes, impacts? What does that look like from the donor side, and how is that impacted by, influenced by the network side, or what are the implications of that for networks? So that's those are some examples of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about this core question of, you know, why. Oh, I missed it. I wondered where I skipped one. I wondered where it went. Sorry, going back. The joys of technology. So we missed the what. I thought it was me. All right, thanks, slide deck. So the what is what funding do donors provide? So what are the types of funding? What are they funding specifically? Are they providing core funds? Are they providing project funds? Is it funds for capacity building? Are there other types of funds? What is the volume or quantity of funding, especially when we're thinking about donor portfolios? What does that look like for them in terms of funding networks? What proportion of funds, what is the proportion of funds that a given network receives? How diverse is a network's funding portfolio on that side? What does that look like, right? And are there different kinds of funding, perhaps, at different stages of a network's evolution as well? So these are some of the core points related to the what. We already spoke about the why. And then the how, the third point here, is, so how do donors provide funding to networks? What are those channels and mechanisms? What does that mean when the network is not a registered legal entity of its own? And funding goes through partners or hosting organizations? What are the implications for networks in terms of their admin and finance, reporting, and all these things? And then are there limitations or conditions placed on different kinds or all kinds, for that matter, of funding? Must there be an evaluation, or do you need to have multiple donors? What does this look like in terms of how donors give funds to networks? So again, our starting point is that there is very minimal to a non-existent evidence base for any of this. And so we're starting with these three questions of the what, the why, and the how, to really start building that. And from there, we can develop further guidance, further information that is helpful on both sides, for donors and for networks. So that's really our goal here. The project itself is laid out in three phases. So the first phase is our outreach and design phase. That is where we are right now. We've just started this. You will see in your weekly Collective Mind newsletter today, us kicking this off officially. And for that matter, sharing an initial survey that we would love to capture as many initial responses to as possible to begin to design this. It's really important for us that this is participatory, as with anything that we do with Collective Mind. And so opportunities to hear from you, such as this community conversation, are really important in defining this research study. After this phase, this outreach and design phase, we'll move into the more sort of formal, typical data collection phase for a number of months. And then towards the end of this year, we will move into the development of findings and development of the guidance. So we see this as a fairly long-term project, around 6 months, perhaps more, depending on how this all evolves as we go, especially given the participatory nature of it. So with that, I would love to hear from you. That's the purpose of our discussion today. So what should we be asking? How should we design this research? When we think about those basic points, those basic questions of the what, the why, and the how, what does this mean for how we design our study? How do we ask questions? What are those questions? Who are we asking them of, for that matter? If we're engaging both networks and donors, there's an assumption we have that we are going to speak more perhaps to donors than to networks to understand their approaches more deeply, but that's an assumption that could be challenged. So we're looking to hear from you. This is the purpose of this conversation. Where would you go with this? What do you want to ask? What would it mean for you? So with that, first, I'd like us to break into, again, very small groups just to start reflecting together and so that you can meet someone. But I'd love to ask if there are any sort of questions, anything I need to clarify, anything I took for granted and forgot to mention. So open to that. And we have Eleonora, if I'm pronouncing your name properly, I hope.
Yes, Kerstin, thank you. And thank you for this introduction to what I think, as you said, it's a very relevant conversation and a very relevant, research. Before we start to dig into that, I wanted to ask you a little bit like, what do you mean by donors? So what is a little bit the range that you are looking at, right?
That's a great question. Thank you. Thank you for that. So we're looking pretty broadly at this. We're assuming we're making some assumptions, right? As one does. So we're assuming that philanthropy, private foundations and such are probably the greatest part of this composition. But we are open to also, speaking to and including, say, multilateral or bilateral donors who perhaps are giving at a global or national or whatever level from the sort of international development space. Really looking fairly broadly at this and trying to be inclusive. Because again, I think our starting point is that there is so little known about this that we need to start with the basics and fill the gaps. So we're casting a really wide net in order to even understand what that looks like, right? Who are the, so we could have perhaps added the question of who, with the what, why, and how. It could be also the who are these donors, which we'll probably gain some insight into over the course of this. But that's, again, we're at this point at least casting that net pretty widely. But that's a great question. Thank you. And I would also say that we are likewise casting the network side fairly widely too. So we are using Collective Mind's definition of networks, which is networks as organizing models who bring together individuals and or organizations who have common interests to achieve shared goals. That's a very wide umbrella type of definition. And we are looking across all kinds of networks that fall under that broad umbrella. We're looking at networks also that work at different scales, from local to global, across all kinds of issue areas, because our focus with this, as with other things that Collective Mind does, is a belief that is based on a belief that networks and the practice of networks is a common experience and a common sort of practice, regardless of your scale and regardless of your scope in terms of the topic or issue area that you're focused on. So we're looking across all of those. So so that side as well is pretty broadly defined here for this study. Great question, thank you, and for prompting me to give extra responses there. Any other questions right now? Anything that needs further clarification? Okay. I take silence as a no. Whoops, hold on, let me check the chat. Oh, okay. Thanks, Erin. So Seema, if we can work our magic and put people into very small groups, either 2 or 3, that would be great. And noting Erin's point that she can't participate. So in case she's maybe logged off, I don't know. But so if we could do that, and we'll just spend like 5 or 6 minutes, just having some initial reflections, meeting one another and sharing initial reflections before we come back.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to send everybody into pairs, so I'll do that now.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
All right, welcome back. Okay, we have a small but potentially fierce group today. So looking to you for your thoughts and insights in this conversation. How were your breakouts? Anything interesting come up for you?
Hi, Kirsten. Hi, everyone. I'm Ellen Graham. I work for the Global Alliance for the Rights of Older People. I was in a breakout room on my own. Nobody joined, unfortunately. So I was a little lonely, but I made some notes and I came up with some thoughts and some questions. So happy to feed those on.
Sorry for that.
That's all right.
Yeah. Please share. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, okay. So I don't really come to this topic with a lot of experience, but I suppose when I was thinking through questions, I think it would be interesting to kind of know a little more about or hear about from donors. I guess I was thinking about whether donors tend to kind of explicitly fund networks or whether they fund networks for the sake of funding networks or have funding programs that are dedicated to specifically supporting networks. I guess I feel that in my experience, probably donors are looking more at sort of key objectives or sort of other priorities like activities and results would come first, and then they would consider maybe what the implementation model is second, maybe. So I was just thinking for those donors that might explicitly fund networks for the for the sake of supporting networks, one question I would have is do they have a preference as to whether they prefer a secretariat for a network to be independent and legally registered as a dedicated organization supporting a network, or they like to fund networks via host organizations that are acting on behalf of that network and playing that role as a contribution to the network. Because we have an ongoing discussion about whether we would be better off from a fundraising perspective if we were legally registered as an independent secretariat, or continuing as we are hosted within a bigger organization that has, for example, a long-term track record of funding and working with donors. And then I guess, another question, I think you mentioned earlier, core costs. And I guess core costs and whether a funder will support core costs and a kind of, I guess, a secretariat function in the context of networks. I think that's probably always a consideration and a struggle with fundraising, whether you're an organization or a network. But I'd be really interested to know whether donors who do provide kind of substantial core cost support, whether they have a view or any experience about whether funding a network secretariat has particular benefits or added value over, for example, compared to a project management or coordination function that is embedded in a single organization. I'd like to think, sort of working with them for networks, that there are particular benefits and added value to network secretariats, but that was just another thought. Yeah, I'll stop there. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to input.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Ellen. And please come back and we won't have you in your own breakout group next time. Sorry, so sorry about that. But good work for reflecting. Much appreciated. Other thoughts? Who else would like to chime in?
Well, I mean, my roommate has left, but we were two in the room, and we had the possibility to discuss and brainstorm a little bit more about the questions. And we are into similar yet different position. I mean, Sarah, she was coming from a philanthropy, so she has that point of view, and she coordinates a fellowship group, which in a way it is a network of individuals, right? But it is also somehow a tangible outcome for philanthropists to finance. So she was saying that one of the questions could be, you know, why and how philanthropists or founders would be comfortable to finance outcomes that are not as tangible as projects. So that's one of the possible questions. From my hand, where I sit, our organization, Arigato International, both convenes a network, the Global Network of Religions for Children, and to the members of the network that are grassroots faith communities, we do provide small grants, so seed grants for projects. But at the same time, we as an organization, we're also grant seekers. We apply to bigger and major donors in order to have more money for projects. And to this end, for example, we found very useful to have a formal secretariat of the network. So, you know, a legal entity that can be receiving the grants. So it's, you know, it's like, of course, our organization sees the value of a network and sees the value of having also outcomes that are not purely tangible, but that are bringing people to work together, particularly in interfaith manner. So, I mean, there is also that component. So in this sense, the topic matters, because, I mean, you can only be a network if you want to bring different religious groups together. It will be very difficult to have an interfaith organization if you are only one, right? So it's for that. So yeah, we brainstorm a little bit around these ideas and also blended models, like in some networks we are part of as a network, we also contribute as members a little bit, and then another part of the funding for specific project is raised to other external donors. So we were putting a little bit all these different elements together, which can inform the research and also the way the methodological questions are asked.
Great. Thank you so much. Jillian or Reagan, would either of you like to share your discussion points?
Sure, and I apologize for the racket earlier. Had a little bit of a washing machine mishap, and I didn't realize that I hadn't unmuted myself. Sorry. So,
all good. The joys of working from home. Yeah, we all understand.
I think that's the first time I've done that, though. So anyway, yeah, I was in a room with Jillian, and I kind of talked a little bit about the longstanding commitments, like how much of a commitment, how longstanding of a commitment are networks willing to make, because a lot of donors seem to be on a 3-year grant cycle, and I think that is really insufficient for what it really takes to get a network going and to sustain it and to get it to kind of the next step, or if you're talking about a new network at least. And then Jillian, I won't speak for you, but I'm happy to summarize what you did say if.
Thanks, Reagan. I could share. So I was speaking about a grassroots network that I helped weave together, and they are grassroots leaders across the city of Toronto coming from low-income neighborhoods. And so they are working to raise awareness of the role that grassroots leaders play in communities, often underpaid and under-resourced. And so a lot of their work involves changing systems, and the same systems that would be funding and don't be funding them and be donors to them. So we have secured funding for them through long-standing relationships with municipalities and with community foundations. But my question is around how to frame systems change work in a way that doesn't scare away funders and donors, because a lot of times it requires them to change.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a great question. I'm just writing it down. So does anyone have thoughts on that? How do we ask questions about that? Are there, if we're thinking about this research, so that's a big question, of course, if we're thinking about it in the context of this research, and sort of getting to the detail of it, what does that mean to us? Any thoughts on that?
I'm curious to know what the literacy of systems change is that donors have. Like, do they really understand it, and do they really is that of importance to them, and is it a priority to them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's an inbuilt assumption there that networks are working on systems change in at least many cases, right? If we're asking that question. I think it also makes me think that it goes back to some of these points about donor expectations and what they're hoping to achieve, what kind of outputs or outcomes or impacts they're hoping to achieve, and what that looks like. The lens you look at a network through, in terms of your expectations and your understanding of what networks do, will impact what you are expecting, and then potentially conditioning your funding for, right? So what I'm thinking about as I hear this is, what are the sort of connections between how well donors understand systems change, understand networks, the potential of networks for systems change, for example, as a foundation for how they design their own grant making, for that matter. Does that sound right? Sound relevant? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that, well, here and I'm sure it's across North America, but here in Canada, foundations are having some really important questions around colonial settler philanthropy and how that impacts the charitable sector, as well as just actually improving the well-being of communities. And so, yeah, I would say some are more ready than others. And so the funder for the network I'm speaking of, like, they are also on their journey of change. And so they see this as an opportunity to work with grassroots leaders and co-create that. But yeah, I don't know how ready the majority of foundations are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that seems right in my experience as well. And similar to what Emily has just shared in the chat. So I think there are probably a sort of set of questions, range of questions around this basic piece of, what do you understand about networks? What does that mean for your expectations, and how you design and structure and condition your funding? What other questions come up? What other ideas come up? We're thinking big picture here of the what, the why, and the how. Are there, so we've had a couple key points. So this was one about donors' understanding of networks, understanding of how change happens, what kinds of change they're looking for, and what that means in terms of how they design and condition their funding. Thanks, Eleonora. And we also talked about the sort of practical side of things of the issue of being a legally registered entity or not, and what that means. Are there other key things? There were some other points as well, but anything else that sort of rises to the top that you would want to know, that you think we should be asking or digging into? I'll mention one thing, just maybe that it will trigger some thoughts from you. So one point in the slide that I talked about, the what for the funding, was about different kinds of funding. So we did mention that, right, about the challenge of covering core costs and such, but different kinds of funding to serve different, outcomes or such. But also perhaps as relates to the evolution of networks. Are there different kinds of funds at different times? Any thoughts on, or for that matter, kind of also the issue around like volume or quantity of funding, and what that means to networks? Any thoughts on those points, the sort of what points, or anything else that's coming up for you?
So does core funding, would that be defined as almost like overhead, or, not project-based, not program-based?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and so what would what outcomes would they want to see out of that? Because that is one of those intangibles for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think in terms of, one of our recent experiences with, we secured funding from a donor that supports international work, and they supported us to conduct some activities that had more of a global sort of focus, but also I think their main interest was perhaps less our kind of network, the coherence, I guess, and structure that we brought as a global network, and a little more, if I'm honest with this donor, about the reach that our network provided them as a donor. So, for example, we were able to identify countries in sort of 2 or 3 regions where we could fund nationally focused kind of project activities. And I think it was that sort of the sort of diversity in our network and the reach, the geographical spread that we had, that attracted them. But ultimately it came down to sort of those measurable activities, and as we've talked about, the more tangible outputs that they were interested in. And I think that was what sort of really helped secure the funding, rather than we want to invest in the development of this sort of global alliance because of the value of that. And as we've talked about, the sort of the change that can happen through investing in that per se. I think it was more, here's a network with 400 members across all regions, and there was some appeal to them in that, maybe. So I'm not quite sure how you would frame that precisely as a research question, but that's just one of our experience, I think, that sometimes it's less selling ourselves as a network and more selling ourselves as who's in our network and where are they located and what are their particular sort of skills or a track record as organizations, for example.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let me ask maybe one other question. Just what are your greatest challenges with fundraising and adequately, properly funding your networks? What are those challenges? What does that look like to you?
I think for us, key challenges are, I think the challenge that, well, I guess it's I think quite difficult to get funding for core costs, which is something that's really vital to the sort of sustainability of us as a functioning network. And I think combined with that is the fact that we're focused almost entirely on advocacy work and campaigning work and less on sort of very tangible programmatic outcomes, if that makes sense. So when those two intersect, it can make fundraising quite challenging, and packaging what we do in an appealing way to donors quite difficult. I think another challenge that we sometimes face as a network is that we get compared a lot to other networks working in the area of human rights, for example, and sort of other UN processes, when I think sometimes those comparisons are maybe not helpful or not useful, or we're expected to work in a certain way that perhaps doesn't really fit with our identity and our membership. And I think there's just sometimes we're expected to fit into a mold that people are familiar with and have seen before. So I think sometimes that's a challenge for us, just in kind of finding the right way to communicate our own particular identity and our uniqueness, if that makes sense. I guess that's another challenge. And I suppose it's another very practical thing, but we have a very small secretariat, and just carving out time to invest in fundraising is incredibly difficult with all the network functions that we're having to juggle all of the time, because fundraising is almost can be a whole role in itself. So yeah, it's probably obvious, but just another challenge.
Great, thanks. Other thoughts on these many myriad challenges, Jillian or Reagan?
Yeah, I could add that challenges with the network I support is the fact that, you know, they don't have charitable status to receive funds directly, and so we are a collaborative partner in that way. But also that makes, well, in general, equity is at the forefront of everything we do with them because of that relationship, as well as amongst themselves, amongst the members of the network themselves. Equity is always at the forefront. And because they're not staff or they're not coming from an organization, it's challenging for them to work through network activities and costs for network activities, but also honoring their contributions, whether that be through honorarium or reducing barriers to their participation with barrier reduction. And so that component takes a lot of time, and I'm not sure, like I do know the donors and funders we have supporting their work has given them a long runway to work through these processes, but the runway is like 2 to 3 years, like Reagan mentioned. Like it is, if not 4 years, like it is a long time, a lot of work. And so that process is so valuable, but I'm not sure if the donors and funders can really appreciate that value in the process.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
I haven't had to fundraise yet because I'm still on a grant that pays for me and to do this work, but I am thinking about the next step, and feeling like I have limited options in terms of who I can approach for this small scale network, and also not really having a total idea of what the outcomes would be, because it's, you know, it's like I mean, Jillian said it really well, that they work in emergence. So it's emerging things. You're supporting the process and not necessarily in control of the outcome. So that seems to be like a hard sell. Like, we want you to support us to do all of these things, but we don't really know what's going to happen at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe just so this is fantastic. I've got lots of notes here, and thank you for all being so candid. If there was sort of, so let's sort of switch mindset from the challenges to maybe something optimistic. So if you could change this this system, or this sort of scenario of funding and fundraising that you are in, or Reagan, in your situation that you anticipate yourself to be in soon enough, what would that look like? What would an ideal scenario look like for funding and fundraising? It's okay to wish. It's okay to dream.
Ideally, I would say the ideal would be funders and donors, decision makers, and just folks that are making decisions impacting communities. Whether they're supporting this work in the network monetarily, they're also supporting it alongside the folks doing the work. So actually, engaging in not just throwing money at the problem, engaging outside of that and more on top of that. And that's specific to the network I'm supporting, and that's really specific for that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. And might not just be specific to your network. I could see that being a more common ideal. Reagan or Ellen, any thoughts on your dream scenario?
Again, I don't know enough about foundations at the moment in this realm of networks. Worked with foundations in other positions before, but not networks. But I don't see that language of networks in RFPs, on websites that foundations host. And just that makes me feel like, well, that's not a foundation that I could even approach. Because I'm also not, do we also need to become educators about what networks are? Or do we just try to find foundations that already get that? So I feel like if there were networks that were actually just putting it out there that they fund networks, they get networks, they are willing to fund for the long haul, they're willing to have unknown outcomes, they're willing to embrace systemic change. Yeah, that would be ideal to me.
Good.
Yeah, I'd echo all of that, definitely.
Good. All right. So just as we wrap up here, we have a couple minutes left. Is there anything else to share? Is there anything else that we haven't discussed that you think we should be considering or keeping in mind as we take this study forward?
I mean, the only other thing occurs to me, I think it could be really useful just to have a way of maybe sharing information about donors that are particularly strong when it comes to network funding networks and supporting networks. Yeah, I think I think just some intelligence or some sharing of experiences with donors that really do seem to have grasped some of those issues better could be really helpful just for practitioners, I guess, in the area. But I suppose we might all be targeting just very different types of donors, so perhaps that's not so straightforward. But
yeah.
And I think the idea of the guidance that you mentioned at the start, Kirsten, about how the research could hopefully, produce this quite concrete sort of guidance, something very practical for donors and networks, sounds really, really valuable. So yeah, look forward to seeing how that comes out.
Good.
I'll just add, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'll just add real quick that it's more of a question than a statement, because I'm just not sure, like our networks, so are they radically different from other organizations that we need a completely different framework other than the goals, objectives, outputs, outcomes, impacts scenario? I mean, I could see network work fitting into that, but I also wonder if there's a different approach that would work better. Yeah. But that could be kind of maybe standardized. Anyway, go ahead, Jolie.
I was just going to add, not really anything more questions, just appreciation that you're raising awareness on this topic of networks, especially at a time when the pandemic has highlighted the critical nature of networks just for our own well-being, and mutual aid has been such a important tool for us here, specifically in Canada. But yeah, I'm just really excited that this is going to be on the radar because of the work you're doing.
That's great. I'm so happy to hear that. And we also think this is really important, obviously. I am, just as we wrap up, I'm posting the link to the survey. That is one of our first steps here, besides this session, in the chat. Would love to have you respond, although I've got lots of feedback from you, but so, feel free to share with other colleagues and your donors for that matter, if you would like to. The more information, the better. This initial phase is running for the next, until about the end of June. And then we'll begin to move into the data collection, which will last for a number of months. But we will keep sending updates and information, and we'll also be doing a sort of summary of the outcomes, the information gleaned from this first step, the survey, this conversation, etc. So watch your newsletter for those things. And as always, there are lots of activities with Collective Mind coming up. Networks 101 next week, Network Management 101 in a couple weeks. Lots of things happening. Our virtual summer camp registration is open. Happy to have anybody there coming up in July, and always happy to hear more from you. This is my email address if you ever want to get in touch. If I can put it in here quickly. And with that, thank you so much for your time, your attention, your ideas, your thoughts and reflections. This was really valuable, and I'm really grateful. So thank you, and keep an eye out for updates. There will be more more coming on this. So thank you.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kirsten. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. All right, I gotta